In machine learning and cognitive science, artificial neural networks are a family of models inspired by biological neural networks and are used to estimate or approximate functions that can depend on a large number of inputs and are generally unknown. Artificial neural networks are generally presented as systems of interconnected neurons, which exchange messages between each other. The connections have numeric weights that can be tuned based on experience, making neural nets adaptive to inputs and capable of learning. For example, a neural network for handwriting recognition is defined by a set of input neurons which may be activated by the pixels of an input image. After being weighted and transformed by a function, the activations of these neurons are then passed on to other neurons. This process is repeated until finally, an output neuron is activated. This determines which character was read. Like other machine learning methods, systems that learn from data, neural networks have been used to solve a wide variety of tasks that are hard to solve using ordinary rule-based programming, including computer vision and speech recognition. Background: examinations of humans' central nervous systems inspired the concept of artificial neural networks. In an artificial neural network, simple artificial nodes, known as neurons, neurodisc processing elements, or units, are connected together to form a network which mimics a biological neural network. There is no single formal definition of what an artificial neural network is. However, a class of statistical models may commonly be called neural if it possesses the following characteristics: contains sets of adaptive weights, i.e., numerical parameters that are tuned by a learning algorithm, and capability of approximating nonlinear functions of their inputs. The adaptive weights can be thought of as connection strengths between neurons, which are activated during training and prediction. Neural networks are similar to biological neural networks in the performing of functions collectively and in parallel by the units, rather than there being a clear delineation of subtasks to which individual units are assigned. The term neural network usually refers to models employed in statistics, cognitive psychology and artificial intelligence. Neural network models which command the central nervous system and the rest of the brain are part of theoretical neuroscience and computational neuroscience in modern software implementations of artificial neural networks. The approach inspired by biology has been largely abandoned for a more practical approach based on statistics and signal processing. In some of these systems, neural networks or parts of neural networks form components in larger systems that combine both adaptive and non-adaptive elements. While the more general approach of such systems is more suitable for real-world problem-solving, it has little to do with the traditional artificial intelligence connectionist models. What they do have in common, however, is the principle of nonlinear, distributed, parallel and local processing and adaptation. Historically, the use of neural network models marked a directional shift in the late 80s from high-level artificial intelligence, characterized by expert systems with knowledge embodied in if-then rules, to low-level machine learning, characterized by knowledge embodied in the parameters of a dynamical system. History: Warren McCulloch and Walter Pitts created a computational model for neural networks based on mathematics and algorithms called threshold logic. This model paved the way for neural network research to split into two distinct approaches. One approach focused on biological processes in the brain and the other focused on the application of neural networks to artificial intelligence. In the late 1940s, psychologist Donald Hebb created a hypothesis of learning based on the mechanism of neural plasticity that is now known as Hebbian learning. Hebbian learning is considered to be a typical, unsupervised learning rule, and its later variants were early models for long-term potentiation. Researchers started applying these ideas to computational models in 1948 with Turing's B-type machines. Farley and Wesley A. Clark first used computational machines, then called calculators, to simulate a Hebbian network at MIT. Other neural network computational machines were created by Rochester, Holland, Habert, and Duda. Frank Rosenblatt created the perceptron, an algorithm for pattern recognition based on a two-layer computer learning network using simple addition and subtraction. With mathematical notation, Rosenblatt also described circuitry not in the basic perceptron, such as the exclusive OR circuit, a circuit whose mathematical computation could not be processed until after the backpropagation algorithm was created by Paul Werbose. Neural network research stagnated after the publication of machine learning research by Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert, who discovered two key issues with the computational machines that process neural networks. The first was that single-layer neural networks were incapable of processing the exclusive OR circuit. The second significant issue was that computers didn't have enough processing power to effectively handle the long runtime required by large neural networks. Neural network research slowed until computers achieved greater processing power. Another key advance that came later was the backpropagation algorithm, which effectively solved the exclusive OR problem. The parallel distributed processing of the mid-1980s became popular under the name connectionism. The textbook by David E. Rumelhart and James McClelland provided a full exposition of the use of connectionism in computers to simulate neural processors. Neural networks, as used in artificial intelligence, have traditionally been viewed as simplified models of neural processing in the brain. Even though the relation between this model and the biological architecture of the brain is debated, it's not clear to what degree artificial neural networks mirror brain function. But the advent of deep learning in the late 2000s sparked renewed interest in neural nets. Improvements since 2006. Computational devices have been created in CMOS for both biophysical simulation and neuromorphic computing. More recent efforts show promise for creating nano devices for very large-scale principal components analyses and convolution. If successful, these efforts could usher in a new era of neural computing that is a step beyond digital computing, because it depends on learning rather than programming, and because it is fundamentally analog rather than digital, even though the first instantiations may in fact be with CMOS digital devices. Between 2009 and 2012, the recurrent neural networks and deep feed-forward neural networks developed in the research group of Jürgen Schmidhuber at the Swiss AI lab IDSIA have won 8 international competitions in pattern recognition and machine learning. For example, the bidirectional and multidimensional long-short-term memory of Alex Graves et al. Won 3 competitions in connected handwriting recognition at the 2009 International Conference on Document Analysis and Recognition. Without any prior knowledge about the 3 different languages to be learned, fast GPU-based implementations of this approach by Dan Syverson and colleagues at IDSIA have won several pattern recognition contests, including the IJCNN 2011 Traffic Sign Recognition Competition, the ISBI 2012 Segmentation of Neuronal Structures in Electron Microscopy Stacks Challenge, and others. Their neural networks also were the first artificial pattern recognizers to achieve human competitive or even superhuman performance on important benchmarks such as traffic sign recognition, or the MNIST handwritten digits problem of Jan LeCun at NYU. Deep, highly nonlinear neural architectures similar to the 1980 neocognitron by Kunihiko Fukushima and the standard architecture of vision, inspired by the simple and complex cells identified by David H. Hubble and Torsten Wiesel in the primary visual cortex, can also be pre-trained by unsupervised methods of Jeff Hinton's lab at University of Toronto. A team from this lab won a 2012 contest sponsored by Merck to design software to help find molecules that might lead to new drugs. Models. Neural network models in artificial intelligence are usually referred to as artificial neural networks. These are essentially simple mathematical models defining a function or a distribution over or both an. But sometimes models are also intimately associated with a particular learning algorithm or learning rule. A common use of the phrase "an model" is really the definition of a class of such functions. Network function. The word network in the term artificial neural network refers to the interconnections between the neurons in the different layers of each system. An example system has 3 layers. The first layer has input neurons which send data via synapses to the second layer of neurons, and then via more synapses to the third layer of output neurons. More complex systems will have more layers of neurons, some having increased layers of input neurons and output neurons. The synapses store parameters called weights that manipulate the data in the calculations. An is typically defined by 3 types of parameters: the interconnection pattern between the different layers of neurons, the learning process for updating the weights of the interconnections, the activation function that converts a neuron's weighted input to its output activation. Mathematically, a neuron's network function is defined as a composition of other functions, which can further be defined as a composition of other functions. This can be conveniently represented as a network structure, with arrows depicting the dependencies between variables. A widely used type of composition is the nonlinear weighted sum, whereas some predefined function, such as the hyperbolic tangent, it will be convenient for the following to refer to a collection of functions as simply a vector. This figure depicts such a decomposition with dependencies between variables indicated by arrows. These can be interpreted in 2 ways. The first view is the functional view. The input is transformed into a 3-dimensional vector, which is then transformed into a 2-dimensional vector, which is finally transformed into. This view is most commonly encountered in the context of optimization. The second view is the probabilistic view. The random variable depends upon the random variable, which depends upon the random variable. This view is most commonly encountered in the context of graphical models. The 2 views are largely equivalent. In either case, for this particular network architecture, the components of individual layers are independent of each other. This naturally enables a degree of parallelism in the implementation. Networks such as the previous one are commonly called feed-forward, because their graph is a directed acyclic graph. Networks with cycles are commonly called recurrent. Such networks are commonly depicted in the manner shown at the top of the figure, where is shown as being dependent upon itself. However, an implied temporal dependence is not shown. Learning. What has attracted the most interest in neural networks is the possibility of learning, given a specific task to solve, and a class of functions. Learning means using a set of observations to find which solves the task in some optimal sense. This entails defining a cost function such that, for the optimal solution, i.e., no solution has a cost less than the cost of the optimal solution. The cost function is an important concept in learning, as it is a measure of how far away a particular solution is from an optimal solution to the problem to be solved. Learning algorithms search through the solution space to find a function that has the smallest possible cost. For applications where the solution is dependent on some data, the cost must necessarily be a function of the observations. Otherwise we would not be modeling anything related to the data. It is frequently defined as a statistic to which only approximations can be made. As a simple example, consider the problem of finding the model, which minimizes, for data pairs drawn from some distribution. In practical situations we would only have samples from and thus, for the above example, we would only minimize. Thus, the cost is minimized over a sample of the data rather than the entire distribution generating the data. when some form of online machine learning must be used, where the cost is partially minimized as each new example is seen. While online machine learning is often used when is fixed, it is most useful in the case where the distribution changes slowly over time. In neural network methods, some form of online machine learning is frequently used for finite datasets. Choosing a cost function. While it is possible to define some arbitrary ad hoc cost function, frequently a particular cost will be used, either because it has desirable properties or because it arises naturally from a particular formulation of the problem. Ultimately, the cost function will depend on the desired task. An overview of the three main categories of learning tasks is provided below. Learning paradigms. There are three major learning paradigms, each corresponding to a particular abstract learning task. These are supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforcement learning. Supervised learning. In supervised learning, we are given a set of example pairs and the aim is to find a function in the allowed class of functions that matches the examples. In other words, we wish to infer the mapping implied by the data. The cost function is related to the mismatch between our mapping and the data, and it implicitly contains prior knowledge about the problem domain. A commonly used cost is the mean squared error, which tries to minimize the average squared error between the network's output and the target value over all the example pairs. When one tries to minimize this cost using gradient descent for the class of neural networks called multi-layer perceptrons, one obtains the common and well-known backpropagation algorithm for training neural networks. Tasks that fall within the paradigm of supervised learning are pattern recognition and regression. The supervised learning paradigm is also applicable to sequential data. This can be thought of as learning with a teacher, in the form of a function that provides continuous feedback on the quality of solutions obtained thus far. Unsupervised learning. In unsupervised learning, some data is given and the cost function to be minimized. That can be any function of the data and the network's output. The cost function is dependent on the task and our a priori assumptions. As a trivial example, consider the model where is a constant and the cost. Minimizing this cost will give us a value of that is equal to the mean of the data. The cost function can be much more complicated. Its form depends on the application. For example, in compression it could be related to the mutual information between them, whereas in statistical modeling, it could be related to the posterior probability of the model given the data. Tasks that fall within the paradigm of unsupervised learning are in general estimation problems. The applications include clustering, the estimation of statistical distributions, compression and filtering, reinforcement learning. In reinforcement learning, data are usually not given, but generated by an agent's interactions with the environment. At each point in time, the agent performs an action and the environment generates an observation and an instantaneous cost. According to some dynamics, the aim is to discover a policy for selecting actions that minimizes some measure of a long-term cost, e.g., the expected cumulative cost. The environment's dynamics and the long-term cost for each policy are usually unknown, but can be estimated. More formally, the environment is modeled as a Markov decision process with states and actions with the following probability distributions: the instantaneous cost distribution, the observation distribution, and the transition. While a policy is defined as the conditional distribution over actions given the observations. Taken together, the two then define a Markov chain. The aim is to discover the policy that minimizes the cost. ANDs are frequently used in reinforcement learning as part of the overall algorithm. Dynamic programming has been coupled with ANDs by Beer-Zekers and Sitzcyclish and applied to multidimensional nonlinear problems such as those involved in vehicle routing, natural resources management or medicine because of the ability of ANDs to mitigate losses of accuracy even when reducing the discretization grid density for numerically approximating the solution of the original control problems. Tasks that fall within the paradigm of reinforcement learning are control problems, games and other sequential decision-making tasks. Learning algorithms. Training a neural network model essentially means selecting one model from the set of allowed models that minimizes the cost. Criterion. There are numerous algorithms available for training neural network models. Most of them can be viewed as a straightforward application of optimization theory and statistical estimation. Most of the algorithms used in training artificial neural networks employ some form of gradient descent, using backpropagation to compute the actual gradients. This is done by simply taking the derivative of the cost function with respect to the network parameters and then changing those parameters in a gradient-related direction. The backpropagation training algorithms are usually classified into three categories: steepest descent, quasi-Newton and conjugate gradient. Evolutionary methods, gene expression programming, simulated annealing, expectation maximization, non-parametric methods and particle swarm optimization are some commonly used methods for training neural networks.